Hi, Joe.
Hi.
That was an adventure. Oh, my Lord. How are you? I haven't seen you for such a long time. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm great. I'm like, that was actually, it was like a hairy, like 10 minutes because I was actually in the meeting room already. And I was like, why is nobody joining? And I'm like looking on the wall and I saw your message. And then Marie's like, I'm not coming. And I'm like, but there's no Joe. I can't seem to find anyone asking me for codes. I'm like, I figured it out. So now I'm
Well
feeling a
done.
little better.
That would be your win of the week then.
Seriously, it actually is a win of the week. I managed to deal with a technology issue without having to call. Well, I just tried to call Becky as well. I'm like, I'm glad I didn't have to interrupt her because I think she's just gotten back from Paris like literally last night. So but yeah,
Oh wow.
it's a cozy conversation for two tonight. So
Oh, so no one else is. I
no,
don't know how because I think it was just Marie and Becky and I last time. So I wasn't sure how many were
yeah.
in the group actually.
There are actually, so normally Amy obviously hosts the masterminds on Thursdays, but she's going to be out of action. So I was actually sort of trying to contact her the other day just to see how she was, but she's actually out of the group temporarily. But yeah, so Marie is almost always here every night, and Becky's obviously popping in and out. But then we've got Jen, who's having parent teacher conferences, and so actually
Yeah.
often this group only it often ends up being sort of two or three of us just having like fairly in-depth conversations about whatever happens to be going on in the week at the time. So but yeah, I watched the last video and you were like, I'll just sit back and listen. And I was like, tonight it might be a little bit different.
It's always lovely to hear from other people, isn't it? And Marie seems to be involved in all sorts of exciting things. So
Yeah, she tagged me on Twitter. There was an event that I had actually like flagged up for, I think it's tomorrow morning, but then I've just realized we've got Halloween at school and I'm judging the costume competition. And so I don't actually think I'm going to be able to get to that. But yeah, she's got so much incredible stuff on the go. I actually don't know how she fits it all in because even with learning pioneers in school, I'm constantly trying to balance things and checking with
yeah,
Becky.
yeah.
And I mean, I thought there was like a masterclass tonight after this, and she's like, no, that's in November. So I'm like, my calendar, I seriously need to sit down and sort this out. But yeah, how are
Are
you
you in
doing?
are you in term four as well? Or how does your school year work?
No, so because we're in the Northern Hemisphere, we follow the Northern Hemisphere school year, which means we've
Okay.
actually
Yeah.
only just finished our first half term and we're, in the second part of term one. But we only have 3 terms here. We don't have 4. So it's the same as the British system, basically. It's the summer, the
Okay. Yeah.
autumn, the winter, or the spring, the autumn. I don't know what it is. Autumn, spring, summer,
Oh, who knows?
winter. Yeah. I mean, I actually worked in London for a couple of years and I couldn't remember what the terms were called. But yeah, so we do 3 main terms that are broken up by half terms, except for the last one, which is one big continuous march to the summer holidays. But we actually have like nearly a 2-month break in Bangkok because the children then can opt in or out of additional language summer schools in their break, which kind of fills the last 3 weeks, which would be the second part of the last half term in the European
Oh,
system.
okay. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
they can either come in and they can do intensive English courses or they can do intensive Thai courses or they do a sports camp. So it's sort of they tend to, I don't know, shorten the year a little bit. I don't argue. I love it. It's a 2-month break. So I feel very lucky to get that. But how's your term going? I know you guys are all talking about reports and assessments last time.
Yeah. It's term four is always hectic. Like it's the culmination of everything. And the end of the year too. So yeah, we're in the midst of reports and everything at the moment. Assessments, but also trying to think ahead to next year. It's that term when you start thinking about how you're gonna change or
Mm.
rethink things. Our whole curriculum is changing next year, so
Oh,
part
really?
of my job is to. So we're still on Australian curriculum, but they've just updated it all. So it's one of those, actually, we've got to really start rethinking, but it's a really good time to start taking a step back and looking at the way we teach. So part of my job is to bring those changes in, but also to do that, taking a step back and reflecting where we've got to and what we need to really be thinking about in our practice and the way we're operating. Yeah, but reporting is kind of key on the agenda at the moment.
How are you guys actually dealing with that? Like what kind of, because I know this was something, obviously I rewatched the video the other day because I was, yeah, the last mastermind I was going to come to, and I was so sick. I was in bed and coughing and just generally unpleasant. So I was like, I might not actually subject all of you to that. Because actually before we ran the live with Guy and Kath, Becky and I just sort of met up with them to make sure everything was working. And, you know, they were like, how are you? I think this is some advice. Oh, it's holidays. You're a teacher. It's always the way. And I just, yeah, I got sicker after that. So luckily I didn't have to do any talking in that. I just had to run the chat, but even that was exhausting. But yeah, when I was looking back over it, I noticed that you guys were talking about, you know, what the focus and the reason of reports were, and whether, you know, you were sort of having a little bit of a grapple around the relevance of how we report. So is that something you're talking about?
Yeah, so yeah, I think we were both on a just chatting about, you get to a point with reports where you hope you get to a point where they're almost meaningless actually by the time you come to them. We use Seesaw to document our learning journeys anyway, and I hope that the parents have got enough information and the kids have inputted enough into that almost the report becomes an irrelevant piece of information, but we still have to do them. So you go through the process, and we still haven't got any student input into our reports, the official documents. They obviously document a lot of their learning on Seesaw anyway. And we've just brought in something called the learner profile as part of the reports too, which is an attempt to build in some dispositions into our thinking too, so that it's just not just reflecting standard curriculum subjects. But that's a work in progress.
What does the learner profile look like? What are you guys adding? So are you basing
looking
that
at things like so we've got a slightly different model for K to 2 and 3 to 5, recognizing there is some progression in some of those dispositions. So looking at things like curiosity, imagination, resilience, how they're collaborating with other people or how they're working independently. So we've kind of selected about 8 of those dispositions that we're really trying to stretch in our learners through this last year, and we're trying to reflect that in some shape or form. But it's just really, without it just being tokenistic, if that makes any sense as well.
I mean, it really does. I mean, I've just started working at an IB school, so I'm in this sort of learning journey myself about how it is that they actually put their portfolios together and what role that plays in reflection, because then they still do write traditional reports, which are still very much teacher-led. And I think for me, you know, I feel sometimes like you walk into places with assumptions. I'm like, oh, it's an IB school, it's all going to be student-led. And in actual fact, I was having this conversation with the grade 3 cohort when we were planning on Wednesday. And I was saying to them, we're actually, you know, this is something we grapple with a lot in our community in Learning Pioneers is, are these obsolete? What is the purpose? And our PYP coordinator actually said, really, it's, you know, it's a document of transition between schools as well. It's something that we actually have to give to schools as children might move on. And I think in the international school sector, you know, regardless of whether they feel obsolete or not, there is actually a requirement for them, because children move within so many different places sometimes that they actually do need to have that transfer. They need to have that document that has information. But yeah, it's at the same time, I was sort of saying to them, like, how can we link? I mean, because we use Seesaw for the younger children's learner portfolios, and then Google Sites for the older children's learner portfolios. And I was sort of saying to them, like, when you're actually doing your assessments, I know you're thinking about teacher comments and you're thinking about those dispositions and those skills and what steps you can recommend and what knowledge they've achieved or they're working towards. But where is the inbuilt reflection for the students? Because that's definitely something that I questioned, particularly during the pandemic, was how do we actually assess children when we're not with them? as well, and how do we make that something that they participate in, and it's something done with them and for them as opposed to them. So yeah, those are all really interesting questions to me, and I don't always have the answer for all of them, but yeah, I definitely had notes down about how assessment and reporting were going, so I thought I'd bring that up and see if there was anything that you wanted to talk through during the session.
It's just an ongoing, like, I don't feel we'll ever get to probably a cross teaching. I'll probably retire well and truly before we ever get to a model of reporting that is really reflective of what our learners can do. But it's I was at a conference where he led a session, James Nottingham, recently, and really challenging us to think about growth in our learners. But it's the age-old question of how you actually measure the growth that's happening, like particularly for those learners that are not reaching particularly high standards, but they're showing incredible growth from where they've started, and you can see it, but you can't necessarily measure it and record it in a way that makes sense to them and makes sense to people at home, who are just still looking. We have to report on grades even for our younger students, from year 1 upwards. We have to give them a grade for every single subject area twice a year, and it almost means everything else then becomes obsolete, because you've got a child that's performing at a C standard, which for us is someone who's reaching that year level standard. But some of our least able learners will never get to that C point through the course of a year, but have at the same time shown incredible growth in certain dispositions and the way they're operating, and collaborative learning skills and their independence. So it's really, really hard to think about how you show that journey to parents well, even through Seesaw and things, I think.
And it's funny as well, because actually we were talking about that too, and even just like the language of reporting and the purpose of parent-teacher conferences. Like, really, parents want to talk about their children. They don't really care if they can do their ABCs half the time, and it's probably not the right way of putting it. Of course, they care whether they can read and write and do maths, but at the end of the day, it's all of those learning dispositions that they're actually much more interested in. Like,
yeah,
are they actually good team workers? Are they good communicators? Are they confident? Are they taking good risks? Or are they, what are the areas that they need to improve on? And I often feel like parents want to talk to us far more than we want to talk to them about what's going on with their children.
Yeah. I think that's certainly true.
I mean, seriously, I've had parents who I'm like, okay, it's been 50 minutes. We need to move this along. I've got a queue forming outside the classroom. So how are you guys going about that, adding, I guess, changing the curriculum and adding learner profiles? And then is that part of your discussion about changing reporting formats?
Yeah, the learner profile came in at the end of last year, and we've just continue to tweak it through. So we report twice a year at the end of every semester. So we have 2 semesters a year and report at the end of each one. And it's also trying to communicate that journey to parents, which I don't think we've done particularly successfully yet. So they're not yet fully on board with what this learner profile is all about. So I need to do some work on that next year, probably. But other than that, it's a pretty traditional journey of assessments and usual Scrabble for some teachers of, have I got enough evidence to show that my child is working above standard or at standard, or whatever the markers are. But I'd love to put some more student comments into, we've got no student input into the report comments. We just have to write pretty standard 200 words on each student, which I actually love doing, because I think it's a really good opportunity again to talk about them as a whole person, rather than just show what the grades will reflect anyway. But there's no students saying, oh, and this was my favorite activity, or this is what I feel I've learned this year as a learner. So yeah.
I mean, I don't actually write reports this year, so it's like, this is like my dream job. I was like, do I have to write reports? I don't have to do any comments at all. But I think, the last school that I was at, I taught at a grade 6 level, and we had to write 4 reports a year. 2 of them, thankfully, were target setting ones, but 2 of them had that, those big report comments. And I think one of the things that I definitely didn't like was the fact that it was all, you know, people would just be copying and pasting, and it kind of becomes like this perfunctory activity. I remember actually when I was watching the video, I don't know whether it was you who was saying this or whether it was Marie or Becky, but it's like this becomes the only thing that term 4 is about for teachers and students, which is such a pity. And I'm like, you know, one of the things that I did, I know Becky was saying after the Trever Mackenzie live the next day, I went in and did it, and she's actually pretty much right. I just basically had filmed conversations with the children where I asked them about how they felt they'd progressed. And I really kind of made it quite targeted so that we talked about all of the subject areas so that I got their feedback on what it was that they were still finding tricky. And so I think one of the questions that I said to them was, what do you think you've made the most progress in? What do you feel most confident in that you didn't feel confident in at the beginning of the year? And what do you still find tricky and you need to work on? And even those, I gave them the questions before we had the conversations. And basically it was just like a 10-minute, like a Zoom meeting or a Google Meet. And the reason that I mean, obviously we're in online learning, but I recorded all of them and then I sent them back to the children so that they could also watch over it as well, because then I asked them to use their own videos to set their targets. So I didn't do any of that. And to be honest with you, like, I mean, I still had to put those comments into the school's, you know, the comments guide, and I had to formalize them and make them sound, you know, like I'd written them. But when I was talking to the parents at the conferences, I then said to them, these comments were co-authored with the children. So they will still look and feel very similar to previous comments. But when I'm saying your child has made the most improvement, actually what that means is this is where they feel that they are more confident. And actually that changed the dynamic of my relationship with the parents as well. So I wonder if that's not a way in for you
That's
to
a great idea.
Just, but it also can kind of incorporate, you know, all of your learner attributes and your learner profiles, because then the children can actually feed back to you whether they're understanding them. And I think when they do, then the parents are on board, you know, when the children have got that language and they can say, actually, I'm getting really curious and inquisitive about things. And the way that I can show that is that I'm starting to take library books out on different topics that I wouldn't have. So you can sort of help them along, I think, with the measurability. But I think it's something that needs to be almost an inquiry in itself, I think, within each grade level, so that you can target it to what the children, you know, what's appropriate for the children. Because I know when I did this, I didn't ask permission. I just kind of did it. And then when my, you know, obviously the reports get proofread by somebody in the senior leadership team. And I said to my deputy head, you know, the children wrote these comments. I wrote them, but they came from their videos. And if you'd like to see the videos so that you can see the follow on from like how they link. And she was totally fascinated by it, because she was like, actually, your reports were so individualized. And I was like, yeah, because it wasn't from me. And I obviously put my teacher judgments in because I give them the grades, you know, and I think that's enough of a teacher judgment. We have to do that. That's part of what we do. But I think, you know, if I was saying to somebody, well, you have definitely improved in your punctuation, but can you be a little bit more specific? Because I notice that you still don't always use capital letters and full stops. So what is it that you feel like you're being a bit more adventurous with? And, you know, just sort of trying to tease those little things out. Like they might, like, I'm using quotation marks when I put speech in my English, or actually now I'm starting to not forget decimal places after I divide something, or, you know, you can kind of give them some examples and give them a little bit of a prompt sheet to help them before they actually have an interview. So I wonder if that's not a way forward for you also with the parents.
I love that idea. I love that idea, because I wonder if it was not too long whether we just show them via Seesaw and just share those conversations with the parents almost ahead of the reports, any kind of written report coming of this is your child talking about their own learning journey, which, as you say, is so much more powerful than just some teacher written comment, almost as an observer in the system. But yeah, that's a great idea. I love it.
I think the other thing that I noticed, because I sort of thought it's a lot of extra work. And that was what I thought to begin with. I was like, oh, this is going to be a lot of extra work. But in actual fact, I wrote those reports so fast because I just had the children's videos playing in the background as I was typing in each comment. So I was like, okay, so how do I put that into like teacher language so that, you know, it is a formal transfer document, but actually it is the child's reflection. I'm just formalizing it. And, you know, and actually that meant that I didn't then have to sit and laboriously go through books and correlate things with grades. And I'm like, it made it so much more fluid. When I said to parents as well, actually your child co-wrote this report with me, they were like, oh, you know, it was like there was like a real tangible sort of buy-in for them as well. And I think it actually really helped improve my relationship with the parents, particularly from online, because we didn't get to see each other face to face for a whole year at one point, you know. So I didn't actually meet any of them in their final year in person. And I think knowing that that kind of collaboration is going on between their child and us gives them more faith and more trust in what we do. And it might break down those barriers of buy-in when you're introducing things like a learner profile that they don't fully understand. So I always just think, you know, when you actually show conversation and you show reflection and you show the child's involvement, like it just changes the parents' feeling about what's going on. And I think it makes them feel more relaxed and more supported, you know. So maybe
into the ideas for tomorrow.
Well, I'm glad. I mean, hopefully it can help, because actually I think when I brought this up with colleagues at school, I think one of the biggest resistances was, well, you're in grade 6 and your children can do things like that. And I was like, well, I think that's a little bit of rock thinking. And I definitely, you know, in the river, I'm definitely a water thinker. I'm like, I definitely get jammed up against the rocks occasionally. But I said to one of my colleagues who was a little bit further down the school in grade 3, could you try and adapt this a little bit for your children? And she did. And she was like, it worked beautifully because they love talking about themselves.
So year 3 is my year group as well. And I think this, they've got to the point now, and this is the beautiful thing about term 4, is you feel like you've got to the point now, actually don't want to let them go because they've come so far on their journey. You've just got them working out, want them to, like, collaboration skills, everything by this point of the year is so much further developed than it was back in term 1. And now they do like talking about what they like doing and how they're improving and where their growth areas are. So to hear that and record that somehow and get that into reports, I think it's an awesome idea. I'm going to think about some questions that might be really relevant to our little people and see what we can get happen. That's an awesome idea. Thank you. I love that.
No worries. I mean, you can thank Trever Mackenzie for putting me on that path, because it never would have occurred to me until I heard him say, actually, it's just actually quite easy. You just have a conversation that you structure so that it's aimed at a child. And I was like, you know, when people like him say things like that, I'm just like, why haven't we been doing this forever? Like, why is this not just what we do? Because actually it saved me a lot of time, because I didn't have to sit there and be like, I've got 25 children's reports to write and this is going to take, I mean, it's still like an hour per report, but without their comments, I think probably, you know, it's usually 2 hours, because you've got to motivate yourself and you're like, ugh. Whereas when you're kind of including things that they highlight, I'll be like, okay, so let's talk about your history now. You know, what did you really enjoy about the history unit? And they will remember something that, you know, I would have been like, they can read a historical text and their diary entries show understanding and appreciation blah, 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 blah. I mean, give them the curriculum document and let the parents see what we're doing, because actually sometimes I feel like that's what reports become about. It's about regurgitating the line items that we've ticked off in an assessment. And for, you know, from a transfer perspective between schools, I see how that's useful, but actually helping children move on, like, reporting like that doesn't tell anybody anything, because they don't even know what you're talking about. The parents don't understand the language that we use. And it's like, how do we sort of bridge that gap and make reporting something which is really about helping children progress and continue what they've done in our grade when they then move on to the next one. And so I think, you know, when you guys are having that conversation and it's school-wide, that's really powerful, because what I don't know is how you would sort of experiment with this for the early years children. And that would fascinate me. Like, that's kind of a next step that I'd be really interested in finding out about. And I wonder if that's not something that we could ask Kat when Kath comes in next time we have a conversation with her, we could be like, all right, Kath, you and Trevor talk all the time. What would your advice be for approaching this with the early years children? Because I'm sure she's got some stellar things to say about that.
It's probably more of a show and tell with little kids, isn't it? But maybe it's a bit of both, where they love to do news and all the rest at the younger. But maybe it's a bit of a learning show and tell of some of their. I think sometimes if they've got something tangible in front of them to show, it's less than just sitting in front of something and trying to answer some questions where they probably can't read or think about those particularly deeply anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking actually when we were talking about assessment, because it was so Wednesday when I sat with the grade 3 team and I was looking at their end of their unit of inquiry. And it's the first time I've sat with a team and written their assessment rubric, which was really fascinating to me because they were having, a lot of the questions that we were asking, they're also grappling with. It's sort of, how do we include the student voice in this without making it an informal document? And how do we do this and how do we do that? And I think there's a lot of ideas, but the rigidity of schools needing to maintain this sort of historical practice of doing reporting this way makes it difficult to sort of, I guess, push against the purpose, because there is a different purpose to a written report, I think. And like I said, it's almost like sometimes I think we should write 3 reports, which I'm not suggesting under any circumstances we move to. But, it's like we do a transfer report in case they need something like that. But that could be like tick boxes. It doesn't need to be something where there's huge report comments. When we do a report which is aimed at parents and bring children's words into it, or the portfolio is the report, so it's kind of like, are we actually doubling up or tripling up on our work by doing all of these things which actually really are aimed at different stakeholders? And it's kind of that why again, like, why are we doing this? What is the purpose? How is this helping children move on? Because if it's not, it's an administration task. And then I feel like there are easier ways that we could go about it. But yeah, I mean, nobody has perfect solutions for this, I think. But the fact that everybody's talking about it and they're trying.
But it's and it's a great idea, but it's also in kind of inbuilt way of getting parents to understand a learning journey, like in terms of dispositions. We're a fairly new school into learning powers and all else, so we're early on in the journey, so we certainly haven't fully got our parent body on board. And any time, like conferences or things we might help, or information evenings, this is where we're at, you'll only still get a small cohort of parents that are super interested anyway. You don't get everybody coming. So it's a way of also communicating more widely through children's voices what this is all about and why it's made a difference to me as a learner and how I've improved and the things I'm excited about. So
yeah. And what I feel, what are my next steps going into grade 4? What do I need to still keep working on? Because I remember saying to I asked my grade 6s, how many of your parents actually share your reports with you? So how many of you do actually open the report and read it with mum and dad? 3 out of 25 of them put their hands up. And I said, who's can I ask also, like, who feels afraid of reports? So, who is fearful of that? I've got Sir next to me putting his hand up. But even as adults, I think that we go through these phases where we're like, we're doing this thing to children for parents. I'm like, I used to be terrified of taking home my report because I never knew what my parents were, what my teachers were going to say, how I was doing, because that was not the way things were done in the 80s and the 90s. Like we weren't having conferences with our teachers and all of this, lovely touchy-feely stuff that we're kind of starting to insert into schooling now. But I often still, I wondered about that. And like half the class put their hands up. They're terrified of getting reports. And one of them is like, my dad says that if my report's good, we can go on a holiday. Or, so, and I was just sort of sitting there thinking, like, we're failing. If this is how children are looking at the reporting end of each of their major terms, they're scared, they're apprehensive, they don't know what we're going to say about them. Like, that's us, we're failing. The school system is failing them right there.
And so all the ones that say, my parents are going to give me $5 for every grade A I
for
get,
every
and you
A
think,
I
you know,
get.
oh,
I
and
know,
then you think, look at their report card and think they're not going to get A's, but look at the growth in their learning.
yeah,
It's
and
just,
it was like somebody asked that question actually. I don't even know, it might have been you in the chat when we were with Guy and Kath. It was like, what does 19 out of 20 mean? And I think it was Marie who said, well, it means you're not perfect. And I'm like, that's horrible. It's actually, when you think about that, it's like the biggest judgment of all time. It's like, thank you so much for working your absolute tushy off over like the last year, but you're not perfect. So, and you know, the 19 out of 20 is, it's just, I've seen children, their faces fall because they don't get a perfect mark on a maths test, and they're judging themselves by these arbitrary measures. And yet I think you guys are collaborating like absolute stars. And at the beginning of the year, you didn't know how to have a conversation about the process of whatever mathematical test we've just finished. You guys have developed the ability to explain things in language, and maybe it's not perfect, but at the beginning of the year, you didn't know. I would say we pull out the words in our learning intentions. Let's try and use this when we're actually explaining a concept, because it makes it clearer. And you're writing these huge paragraphs because you think you want to impress us with what you're saying. And all I want to see is, you know, there is a decimal point here because the place value goes to hundredths. And you're using that language now, you know, but there's no grade for that. You don't get an A for improvement because you're suddenly starting to use the vocabulary. It's, maybe you got one more question right on a test. And I'm like, if that's the only sort of benchmark that they get throughout the year, and then they're terrified of reports, their parents aren't sharing them with them, they don't know what their targets are because we're setting them for them instead of themselves, then the whole purpose of it's gotten lost. So I think one of the things that I was saying to the grade threes is, you know, why you've got your assessment rubric, and I understand that needs to feed into reporting, but why not have a separate assessment conversation with the children where you set them some questions that they think about for each of the units, and they record their own reflection on Seesaw, but you make it about your learner profile. It's not a knowledge-based assessment. It's a, you know, these were the 3 learner profile attributes that we were really focusing on. It might be collaboration, I don't know, collaboration, perseverance, and open-mindedness. How do you feel like you have improved? You know, what evidence can you think of? Well, at the beginning of the year, I wasn't very kind. Sometimes I wouldn't listen to people, or I got really frustrated because my team were dumb and I was, you know, they moved too slowly for me, or, you know, however children think. And then sort of think about getting them to actually reflect on how far they've come on those and what their next steps might be, so that at the end of the year, at the end of your reporting time, they may have 2 or 3 reflections from things that they've done in each of their subjects to actually go back and say, wow, in February, I wasn't really a very good team member. And I can see that because my reflection on that was that I had to improve my teamwork. So how have I come in that? Do you sort of know what, am I making sense of what I'm saying?
Oh, I love this idea. My brain is now going, oh, now I can think about this.
I mean, it's a real sort of passion project for me, even though I'm not in reporting mode at the moment. So I'm in a really sort of privileged position that I sit with.
I'm really passionate too about getting kids to own their learning journeys, and we do lots of conferencing, particularly in English and maths, with next steps, but I've never really thought about even videoing or recording that in any way. Often when you get year 3s to write reflections, what they write is not necessarily what they want to say, because their writing is not yet caught up with actually their way of thinking. But
exactly.
To record that oral conversation would be really powerful, I think.
And then to have it in a place that they can continuously access it as well, because I think that's the thing. We talk about student reflection and then revisiting reflection to, you know, to encourage them to understand how we go back, and we have to self-coach. Again, something we're talking about with Graham Powell at the moment. It's like, when we're coaching others, we really need to start with ourselves. And I sort of think as teachers, we're constantly going back and we're constantly revisiting and reflecting and thinking, well, what went well with that? Can I apply something that I did last year to this cohort? Maybe, maybe not, because it's a different group of children. So we are constantly undergoing this process. And I feel like we don't allow I don't know. I think sometimes we say things like time gets in the way, or opportunities, or how do we do this? And I think sometimes we overthink it. It's children are very visual. They're very, they're prolific social media users. They love the iPad. So make it their source of reflection. What do you think about this? We've been talking about this one area of the learner attribute. So today we're going to do a reflection on that. We've just done an activity that's really collaborative. How do you feel like you did in that? And then they can folder those little videos under the learner profiles and see what that progression is. At the end of the year, you say to them, okay, let's have a look at what you said about your collaborative skills in February. Let's have a look at what we said about your curiosity in March. Where are you now at? How have we shown that? Well, we've shown it because you've actually shown that you're reflecting, and your discussion means that your language is richer. You're now speaking about things in a more open-minded way. You are demonstrating the ability to use a range of different skills that you weren't even aware existed. Or it's about growing that awareness, I think, and that language to discuss. So I think you guys have got such a great opportunity, because you're doing all of this restructuring, to actually get people to experiment with it and make it an inquiry.
Well, I want to do it. I want to do it now. My reports are due in 3 weeks. So I want to do it now. I want to take it in on Monday morning with my little group of learners, and see how they'll respond with I think it's sometimes trying stuff out for yourself. You can then take it back to staff and say, like you did with yours, take it, this is how it worked. This is how we might tweak the process and the questions we ask them and the way that we present that information and the things we take out of it. I'm excited.
Oh, good. I mean, I think that's the most powerful thing as well. So I think you have an opportunity that I didn't have, to be able to actually scaffold that with a whole class discussion about, what kinds of things we might be able to reflect on. And, you could even do some anchor charts with the children in groups so that they've got the language to be able to refer back to, because I know exactly what you mean. You say to a grade 3 child, so talk about your group work. They'll be like, yeah, I was okay. And I'm like, well, let's think about the language that maybe we might need to think about. So, what kinds of roles did you take on in the team? And actually that's a little, that could be a pre-assessment inquiry for each of them. And you can get them in small groups thinking about what kinds of things would we say about being curious? How do we show that? How do we think we demonstrate curiosity in our learning? How do we show resilience? What are the things that we can measure? And how do we think we can measure them? Because I think really when those things come organically from the children themselves, and then they can share those and use them to really sort of help like scaffold a response, then you're really getting them to actually like practice and demonstrate, the use of language, which is going to be far more powerful later on. If we started that from an early age, and I mean, I can see it at my school, because they do the first 3 weeks are an inquiry into ourselves in PYP. And so it really is looking at the learner profile and the attributes and what they mean. And that, I think, really sets the children up very, very well, because, today I had a conversation in my library session with a group of grade 4s, and the whole school's read Creepy Pair of Underwear just before Halloween. I don't know if you've read that book, but we're doing, I mean, really works for 3-year-olds right up to 11-year-olds. So it's beautiful. They appreciate it on a range of different levels. But because the main idea of the book really is facing your fears, and so I've said to the children, I want you to share via flip what your deepest fear is and what the story is behind it, because we're talking about the fact that there's very rarely something that we're afraid of that doesn't come from an experience which has kind of burned itself into our mind. So you might be afraid of cockroaches because one ran over your foot once when you were sitting at a cafe and you didn't like the feeling of its legs. Or you might be afraid of dogs because, in the late at night soy dogs in Bangkok, they get in these groups and they can be really intimidating and they bark and they're noisy. And so I was saying to the children, you've got to remember that this is a real risk-taking activity. I'm asking you to take a big risk because we're sharing something which is deeply personal. So we also then have to think about our other learner, attributes, which are kindness and being principled in our responses. So we're going to show kindness by not laughing or making fun of somebody's fear just because we don't relate to it. We're going to be principled in thinking about how we interact, or how we, how we take on board other people's fears when those are shared with us. So what we might not do if somebody says, I'm afraid of ghosts, is go up and frighten them and be like, boo, or try to be, that's not actually funny for a lot of people. But the children, because they understand the language, are like, the buy-in is so much deeper. And they were like, yeah, risk takers, and this is a risk. And I had some really interesting questions come out of that, like, what if my fear is something that I don't want people to watch on a video? And I said, okay, so do we have to know what your deepest fear is, or could you tell us what your third deepest fear is? Could you share something that maybe you're a little bit afraid of that has a funny story so that you're not leaving yourself so vulnerable? So what are the choices that you're then going to make in what you choose to communicate? So there's, when you actually spend time setting things up with children like that, and then you use the language purposefully and repetitively in all of your different language, library uses it, PE uses it, art uses it, music uses it, and in the classroom you're using it, then the children start to use it as well. So, I think you're at the end of the year experimenting with something, which is great, because then you've got something to take at the beginning of the year. But as you set your curriculum up for the beginning of the year, maybe that's a conversation that you can do as a staff inquiry in your inset, is how do we actually about this and embed
I love
language.
even the idea of just launching the year with an inquiry about learning and the way we learn. We kind of dive into learning dispositions as part of everything we do without really taking a step back and doing even that level of thinking, which you just talked about, which would be so powerful to do that across the whole junior school.
Yeah. I mean, it puts everyone on an equal footing, and it gives you, at the end of that unit, what each of the classes does is they create a collaborative agreement. So I don't know, were you with us when we had Adrian Bethune in?
Last year, was that sometime last year? I remember he came to one of the lives, didn't he? We've read his book. Yeah. I think I was.
So I know that his book's not talking about PYP, but I'm like, this is the first time that I've sort of seen a whole school do like the tribal classroom practice. And, each of the classes go about this inquiry differently, and that's totally fine, because I think, you don't want cookie cutter teaching, you want individuality to come out in the approaches that people take. But one of the things that he was talking about is the power of having something like a team flag, or, when we sort of thought about tribal classrooms, we didn't do a flag, but we had team mascots. And each year I added a toy to the mascot team and the children named it together. So it was almost sort of something that there was like a buy-in for them. But like at our school, we actually do a collaborative agreement, and that collaborative agreement is full of I can and I will statements. So they're really positive, but because the children spend sort of 2-3 weeks building their understanding of the learner profile and how they should put those together, it's really powerful to see what happens when they put them in action. So like I was out in the playground watching some grade ones playing, and I'm not sure if I've told this story in one of the masterminds or not, but I know you weren't there. There's a little girl who'd had a bucket of water thrown all over her by a little boy at the sand pit. You just see some trouble brewing. So I strolled on over to be like, oh, all right, Miss Berg's going to have to get involved here. And as I approached, she was literally dressing down this little boy, and she was just like, do you not remember that in our collaborative agreement, we said that when we're at the sand pit, we will not throw water on one another? And he was literally standing there and he was like, yeah. And I was like, okay, so you guys are good here. And I just walked off, because actually they were actually, moderating their own behavior, and they were actually confronting one another using the language from these collaborative agreements that they'd made about different sort of aspects of what they were doing. And obviously throwing water at the sandpit is something we discourage anyway, but none of them really like it. So that was something that they put in their collaborative agreement. And I was just like, I've never seen 2 5-year-olds just deal with their issues.
Negotiating between themselves. I love that.
I know, it was, I had to try not to laugh, because it wasn't funny. It was actually amazing, but it was also like the funniest thing I'd seen in the playground for a while, because he was just standing there and he's like, yeah, I've got nothing to say, because actually I do know what you're saying. Like, I remember writing that. I'm really sorry. And I was like, you guys have got this, I'm out. So yeah, I just think even like a change in the way that we discuss and that we introduce these things with children, if they're doing it from the beginning of the year, when it comes to things like report writing at the end of the year, they've got the language to be able to be reflective and to be able to genuinely figure out what their next steps are. So yeah,
I love these ideas.
I think
So
it's
do you do that across from kindergarten through to year 6? Would you do that sort of thing? Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, and they put them up, so they actually display them. Each class has done it a little bit differently. So some of the classes have got huge, big sort of individual, each child has put an I can statement together, and they've all sort of put them up together. So there might be quite a lot of them, or there might only be sort of 4 or 5 of them, which are main ones that they're working on, and they've done that in teams. So I think the older children tend to be a little bit more in depth. The younger children tend to use like sort of team-based ones. So when I go into EY1, for example, their collaborative agreement is very much things like, we will not grab toys, but it's done in a really positive way. Like, we will share our toys with our friends. And I think that's another thing. They don't call each other their classmates. They say, we say friends. And as teachers, we say that as well. Something like, hello, grade 3 friends. Can you please make some room for our friend over there? And I think putting all of this in, like, really, it's such a simple language change, but, it makes it really clear to everybody that the expectation is, whether you like one another or not, we will treat each other in a friendly way, and in a way that's respectful, and in a way that we would want to be treated. And it just softens and it changes like the way that the environment feels, I think. And so for me, it's just like, it's going from a school that's very prescriptive and it's very traditionally British into this environment. For me, it's like a constant source of amazement. I'm constantly looking around and I'm like, and these things just happen fluidly because they are embedded right from the beginning, right till the end of school. And every teacher is on the same page. So I think really that's kind of what you need to do. I think it's always approaching new ideas so that you can sort of say, this is the value that it's going to add. And that value is that behavior management is not really an issue. It's not that there's not behavior that needs to be managed, but because the focus is so much on the positive reinforcement of the behavior of most, as opposed to, you should not do these things, do not run on the stairs. There's no negativity in the way that it's structured, which means that the children don't feel the need to push boundaries that actually aren't there, because they're the ones who created their own boundaries. And again, this is just all about ownership. And I think, as teachers, we scaffold this incredibly heavily and we know what direction we want it to go in, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to just sometimes give the reins over to the children and make them feel like it's them who are actually setting those boundaries and those barriers, because then they'll enforce them, and 5-year-olds can do it. I think adults can make that change as well. So, but yeah, it's just conversations, really, isn't it? It's conversations. It's having teacher buy-in. It's making sure that everybody feels like they're not doing something extra and that it's actually going to save them time, or it's going to be a benefit to them. And I think things like the reporting, like I had to do the reporting a few times and kind of throw it in front of a few different leaders. But by the end of the time that I was at my previous school, they had had a whole conversation about how they were going to reimagine their reports. And so student feedback was then written into it this year for the first time. And that's the result of me just slowly pushing, but in a solution-oriented way, and saying, guys, give it a try. You would be surprised at how much time it saves you. And actually, I remember messaging Trever on his Twitter and saying to Trever, I'm like, I never thought I'd say this, but I actually enjoyed writing reports because I felt like the children were on the journey with me, and it wasn't me just judging them, which I hate. I hate that. And I think most of us do. So
it's a perfect time to be thinking this through, though. So, and it's a perfect time to be thinking about the start of the year, because that's part of my job over the next few weeks, is to start planning that early, the stuff for 2023. So it's exciting.
Yeah, it is. I think you're in a in a really fortunate position because you do sort of get to shape the conversation. And I think if you go into it with a really positive, like, this is actually going to improve things on the following levels, like, what are the problems that we all have? What are the things we hate about being a teacher? What are the things that really, you know, we struggle with and we grapple with ourselves? Report writing will be at the top of everybody's list. No one likes report writing. And then, you know, behavior. And behavior is something which is such a massive conversation post-pandemic at the moment that we really need to be looking at new ways of going about it. And I think all of those new ways are already there. It's just they're not done consistently, and they really do need to be done across the school for it to work. Otherwise, you've got some teachers being renegades, and then the children going to another year level where the expectations are completely different. And I think that it's that consistency which is really key. So it's, you know, it's actually working out some kind of framework where you can make situations like this work for the students at the top end of the school as well as students at the bottom end of the school, and show that sort of the importance of that flow on between each of the classes as well, so that they are building from, you know, from starting this very, very simply when they're younger to really thinking about more complex behaviors and complex learning attributes that they need to be focusing on before they hit high school, because then they're independent. And I mean, I started my career as a high school teacher, and I'll tell you right now, children come into year 7 and you just expect them to be different. And when I started working in primary, I was like, oh, it's amazing. Like, as a year 7 teacher, I think we think primary school children have a year of development in their 6-week holiday. They don't. They're grade 6s when they come in, and yet we expect them to be able to be independent. We expect them to be able to problem solve. We expect all of these things. So if those are not being built properly in primary school, they come in and they're already at a disadvantage when they're in year 7. And some of those children will never re-engage and they will never catch up. And that's really where you lose them, I think.
Yeah, it's Monday morning is we call it Monday morning meeting, and it's where anyone can bring anything to the table is the idea of it's our campfire time. And so this is going to be Mrs. Hazel's bring to the table. We're going to reshape the way our reports look. We're going to have some conversations. What are those conversations going to look like?
And I think, you know, I think it's really important to sort of highlight, that doesn't mean we have to do dramatic format changes. It doesn't mean that we actually have to change the style. It just means we have to think about how we include student voice in our own commenting. Yeah. And when we don't have to do the commenting, it actually, I really, really, the biggest thing that I was surprised about was how enjoyable I found it, because I'd sit and I'd listen to the children's videos and they were funny. And some of the things I'd be giggling along with them. Or I remember one little boy in particular, actually, I mean, he was funny anyway, but when we were talking about their personal and social comments, so the big teacher comment at the end, and I said to all the children, part of this will be, you know, me commenting on how I feel that you've done, but I want most of it to be acknowledging what you found challenging, what your favorite learning opportunity was, what did you enjoy outside of the classroom, what was your favorite extracurricular activity, was it a school trip, was it a camp, was it something, you know, because we had a bit of a weird year that year where we had them in for a couple of months and then we went back to online learning. And that year they'd gotten to go on a residential. And so, you know, they actually did have things like, there was a sports day that year, and there were a few little bits and pieces. And I could say, all right, so, you know, what leadership roles have you enjoyed taking on? How did you feel about being in the school production at the end of, you know, the Christmas concert? Or is performance something that you want to talk about? And, you know, they had all of these different sort of opportunities to bring a comment in about how they enjoyed school. Not what their learning was, not how they felt that they'd improved their knowledge. Like, what was it about school that they'd really enjoyed? What were they going to take with them at the end of that year? What were their best memories? And then I said to each of them, be prepared for this one, because it's a tricky question. But if I asked your 2 best friends how they would describe you, what do you think they would say to me? And I gave them that as a preparation, because it was a tough one. And even after a little bit of thinking, some of the children still struggled with it. So again, we had conversations about some of the things that maybe I'd say about my best friends. I'd be like, they're really supportive, they're really loyal, they're easy to talk to, you know, so that when I was saying, this is how so-and-so fits in with his peers, or this is how he interacts with people, again, there was some kind of reflection from them built in. And he was just like, I think that people would say that I am very smart. And I was like, yeah, true. And he said, and quite funny, and actually very good looking. And I remember just losing it, because I was just like, you know what, the funny thing about that comment is that when people think you are funny, you actually are usually better looking as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if you're right. But I mean, there's a humor, you know, so when you're asking children stuff like this, they say some of the most like surprising things, and that just like gives a little bit of joy to what it is that you're doing, which is an otherwise laborious task. So I don't know, I love throwing a little bit of something like that in there, because it really doesn't have anything to do with anything, but it gives you a bit of their personality, and that alone helps you to place each child when you're trying to write a long teacher comment at the end of a report, instead of Sally has fit in well this year. She gets along with her peers and her teachers and is respectful in her interactions with others. She listens effectively and blah, blah, blah. You know, Sally's sense of humor is outstanding. She really enjoys making others laugh, and others enjoy laughing with her. Like, she sensibly makes jokes in a mature and blah, blah, blah. But like, you know, it gives you that lead in, which actually, you've got 20, 30 children that you're writing a report comment on. I mean, some of them disappear into that middle ground, don't they? It's tough. You know, like I don't really have a lot to say about some children because it's hard. But then when they start giving you that information, you're like, cool, okay, I can like now take this, and it brings their personality into a report, which I think is the thing that's missing the most of the time.
Oh, thank you. I really love these ideas. I will send you some snapshots of what comes of my first attempt.
I'd love to see that, seriously, because I'm really sort of pushing for a similar thing to happen. I mean, we do it a little bit, a lot more of this sort of stuff happens at my new school, but, you know, even sort of trying to say, when we were putting these rubrics together, actually, like, could you not use these reflections as your report comments? I don't think they understood what I meant. And so, you know, for me, there's like a little bit of a journey that I'm kind of trying to push as well, which is a little like trickier when I don't write reports, because everyone's kind of like, Berg, why do you care? And I'm like, I care because at the end of the day, I am a full school teacher. And so I would like to read some of these. I would like to see the children's reflections. I want to be able to access their portfolios and get to know them on that level, so that I can actually identify their learning strengths and weaknesses in a library context, because that helps me help them, you know, look for passions. It helps you get to know them. But when it's cut and paste and 24 report comments that are essentially the same, there's nothing there. There's no point reading them at all. So.
All right. Challenge is on.
I love it. I love it. Well, I'm glad that, you know, my experimentation can benefit you, because I feel like this is something which is not, you know, like I said, when Trevor said it, I was like, it was like a light bulb moment for me. I was like, we don't actually have to make it that hard. It's not a massive change from what we're already doing. We just need to do one thing a little bit differently. And actually, it might change the way a lot of people feel about report writing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
You are so
It's been
welcome.
lovely to chat.
I know. I'm happy I finally figured out how to work this. I was like panicking for a minute. I'm like, oh, I'm going to be the first person who's hosted the Mastermind who can't get into it. Like, but no, I figured it out. So
oh, no, it's great. And it's great to just have a conversation anyway. So that's been super. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. It's really lovely to have you in here again. We've definitely missed your face. So
I'll see you on the community, no doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely need to be a little bit more in that after my sickness. But yeah, I think we're going to start with Kat's book in the next one, from what I was gathering. I think I've got notes here saying read the intro. So
yeah, I've got it up on the shelf. So I'll do the same. Lovely to chat and have a really good few weeks.
Yeah. So yeah, you too, Jo. I hope it goes well, and definitely keep me posted on how it goes. And if you need to game anything out, so just send me a message on Learning Pioneers, and I'll see if I can offer some more pearls of wisdom.
Thank you so much.
You're
See you
welcome.
again.
Bye.
Bye.